This is John Quinn. This is Law Disrupted. On October 7th, over 1,000 Hamas terrorists crossed the Gaza border and massacred approximately 1,200 Israeli civilians and soldiers and abducted about 230 more as hostages. Israel has since responded against Hamas, killing thousands of Hamas terrorists, but also many civilians. Under any measure, this is a terrible tragedy on both sides. But we're lawyers, so I want to talk about today is how these events should be viewed from a legal perspective. And it doesn't seem to me to be straightforward. We're going to be talking with Major Ben Wahlhaus, who served in the IDF's International Law Department for many years. He retired, went into private practice, was with a law firm in Tel Aviv. After October 7th, he was called back to active duty, whether he advises the IDF on issues relating to the laws of war and how they apply to operations in Gaza. Major Wahlhaus, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
But how does one get to be an expert in this area? You're the first expert on international law as it applies to war who I think I've ever spoken to.
Well, I mean, international law is a body of law just like any other law, and the law of armed conflict, or it's also known as international humanitarian law or the laws of war, is one body within international law which regulates the conduct of armed conflict. And this was something that interested me when I was doing my studies as a law student, and it was something I wanted to work in. And the Israel Defense Forces actually has quite a reputation for being very well versed in the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. They really developed some experts who are known worldwide. So it was my aim to serve in that department, and I was very fortunate to serve there for many years.
Can you give us some idea of the size of that legal department that advises the IDF on these types of issues?
Sure. So my department, the International Law Department, we're about 30 or 35 officers, all lawyers, all trained in international law and military law and military issues. We're part of a bigger unit, what you call in the US the JAG Corps. In Israel, it's the MAG, the Military Advocate General, because in the US, the judges and the legal advisors are in the same unit. In Israel, we have separate units, Military Court Unit and the Military Advocate General Corps. And that unit is made up of a few hundred officers. And in addition, Israel is very reliant on its reserve duty soldiers and officers. We have a few 100,000 reserve soldiers who are operating now in Gaza and up on our northern border where we're also being attacked daily. So also in the legal unit, in the International Law Department, we have tens of lawyers who receive training throughout the year in international law. And when we have times of emergency like this one, they get called up to predetermined positions and they complement the advice that we give as the core unit.
So you have a client here, it's the IDF, and what is the interaction like? I mean, is it similar to private practice? There's an issue, there's a proposed operation, there's a proposed scenario, there's an actual scenario, a situation unfolding on the ground, and you get a call and they seek legal advice?
Right. So, we give advice on a range of issues. It can be targeting, it can be detainees, weaponry, obligations towards the civilian population, cyber issues, international legal proceedings, and so on. And we give that advice from the chief of staff and the general staff, which are the leaders of the military, all the way down to we sit at about the division level. And the divisions are the ones who are actually maintaining and commanding the actual fighting on the ground. So we sit, for example, in the Southern Command, where they're managing the fighting in Gaza. We sit at the units on the border with Gaza that deal with humanitarian aid and obligations towards the civilian population. We sit in the headquarters in Tel Aviv and we'll review weaponry for its legality or detainee policy or so on. In terms of targeting, the way it works is we are very much involved in the process. So, for example, you'll just to simplify it, imagine you have a few guys sitting around the table. One's an intel guy, one's an operations guy, one's a weaponeering guy, and a commander. And the intel will bring a piece of intelligence and say, in this structure, in this residential home, there's a weapons depot. the weaponeering guys and the operations guys will say, okay, in order to achieve our military aim of taking out that weapons depot, you should use this kind of munition. Note that next door there's a hospital, so maybe attack it from so-and-so angle, so the shrapnel goes the other way. Or note that next door there's a kindergarten, so maybe do it at nighttime where no kids will be around. And the lawyers are a part of that process. We'll say, yes, that meets the definition of the military objective under international law. These are the kind of precautions that you need to consider under international law and so on. So we're a member of the team, and we give our input. At the end of the day, the commander makes his decision about what he wants to do.
Now, as a lawyer in a law firm, it varies from lawyer to lawyer, practice to practice. But, we come into the office, we know, okay, we've got X number of things that are on the calendar for that day that we know that we need to deal with that day, we expect to deal with. And then on any given day, there'll be some pop flies, some things that come up that we had not anticipated. Sometimes those can overwhelm the calendar, so we never got to what we intended to do in the first place. Sometimes there may be only a couple of calls that are off the schedule. I mean, can you give us a sense of what your day is like in that regard? How much of what you do is something that's scheduled and you're going to be asked to deal with that on a given day, and how often is it something that comes up and you need to respond to something that's actually happening?
I wish I could give you that kind of information, but from my experience, one of the things I've learned from my time in this unit is that when it comes to war, you can't really predict anything, and each day looks entirely different to the day before and is entirely driven by the events. So, obviously this war, which began with Hamas's invasion of 7th of October, where they crossed the border from Gaza, in a number of spots, and raped and burned and tortured and murdered and maimed over 1,200 women and children and men and entire families and elderly, and kidnapped over 250 people into Gaza. So that obviously was not something that we started or we expected or we wanted. So it came obviously as quite a big shock to Israel. And from then on, everything has just been about dealing with that situation. And there have been so many developments along the way that it's very hard to predict what our next day will look like. Like if we just put Gaza aside, what's happening on our northern border with Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel, anti-tank missiles, snipers, mortars, and so on from Lebanon and from Syria is enough to be considered a war in and of itself, but it's a secondary front at the moment. And the fact that we're getting fired ballistic missiles at us from Yemen is in itself sufficiently serious. But again, we're trying to keep those arenas quiet while we focus on our main task at hand, which is retrieving and releasing the rest of the hostages that are in Gaza, and making sure that Hamas can't do a repeat of October 7, which it has said explicitly that it openly and very much wants to do it over and over and over again until Israel is destroyed. So every day looks a bit different, and it depends on the circumstances.
Right. So let's back up for a second. You advised the Israeli Defense Forces on applicable international law. What are the sources of that law that you're advising them on?
Right. So as I mentioned, international law is the law that regulates relations between states. And the laws of war, or the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, that's the law within international law that regulates the conduct of armed conflict. And there are a couple of sources for this law. It's not like a national law where you have legislation or case law. We have what's called customary international law, which is basically rules that everyone agrees bind you. And then you also have rules that are in treaties, like the Geneva Conventions, where everyone has signed up onto those rules. And they include rules as what you can target, how you treat detainees, weaponry, civilian population, and so on. They also include a very strict prohibition on hostages, which is what Hamas and Islamic Jihad have done. So those are the sources of international law.
Well, so the terrorists came from Gaza. On October 7th, 1,000 of them crossed the Gaza border and performed this massacre that you've described, under any measure a terrible tragedy. But Gaza is not a state. How does Israel view these terrorists and view Gaza from a legal perspective under international law?
Right. So you're 100% correct. Just it was almost 3,000 militants from Gaza that crossed the border. Gaza is not a state, but the international law that regulates conflict applies to everyone, states and non-states alike. So Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other terrorist groups in Gaza are as much obliged to abide by the rules of international law as Israel is. Obviously, they don't, and they openly state that they target civilians and kill civilians, and they fire rockets indiscriminately into Israel, and they take hostages, and they execute hostages and torture hostages. All of these things are clear violations of international law. But that doesn't change our obligation to international law, even though we're fighting with this asymmetry that we have, on the one hand, a democratic state committed to international law and the rule of law, and on the other hand, a non-state actor who seeks to use and exploit that law for its own advantage. That doesn't change our commitment to making sure that our conduct abides by international law.
So in terms of Israel's obligations under international law, vis-a-vis the inhabitants of Gaza and Hamas, it really doesn't make any difference whether or not Gaza was a state or whether these were state actors. The obligations remain the same.
Well, I mean, there are some differences between what we call an international armed conflict, which is usually conflicts between states, and a non-international armed conflict, which are usually conflicts that take place within a state's territory with a non-state armed actor. But as a policy decision, in terms of our military operations, we generally apply all the rules of an international armed conflict, which are obviously the highest standard and the strictest standard. So from a policy perspective, it doesn't really make any difference practically, because we're applying those more stringent rules.
I mean, what are some of the main rules or elements of the law of armed conflict which are applied here?
Sure. So let's talk about three of the really cardinal rules in terms of targeting. The first one is called the principle of distinction. And this is one which is easy for everyone to understand. It basically says you can't intentionally target civilians, and you can't intentionally target civilian objects. You can only target military objectives. And this is something that we put a lot of effort into to making sure we comply with this. We have huge intelligence gathering efforts. We have doctrines for what kind of intelligence we can use, what standard of intelligence we need, who approves certain categories of targets, and so on. Obviously, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they violate this principle, by attacking civilians intentionally in Israel. But also in terms of the way they operate inside Gaza, they use civilian objects in the civilian population in a very systematic and purposeful way in order to try and make it harder for us to abide by this principle. So when they use homes and schools and UN facilities and hospitals and the like for the military operations, they're doing that in order to make it harder for us to distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives, and also to draw condemnation when the imagery that comes out in the press afterwards are of ostensibly civilian objects that have been harmed. So that's the principle of distinction. And they do this particularly with places like hospitals, which under international law enjoy special protection. Every civilian object, the second you use it for military purposes, for example, it becomes a legitimate military objective. But under the law of armed conflict, hospitals, there's a specific prohibition against using it as a shield for military operations. And one of the things that we've shown consistently throughout this conflict is how Hamas has used all of the hospitals that we've been in. Every single hospital that the IDF has arrived at, we've shown evidence of Hamas's military use. And unfortunately, by doing that, they lose their special protection. But more importantly, they endanger the patients and the staff that are there. But we're making a very big effort to only make sure that we're operating against those objects that Hamas is using for its military purposes and otherwise constitute military objectives under the law.
That's the principle of distinction. What are the other rules that you referred to that govern the application of international law here?
Right. So once you've defined something as a military objective, it doesn't mean you can just go ahead and attack it. One of the really important principles is this principle of precautions. And that basically says that you have to take feasible measures to try and mitigate civilian harm. And we do this in a number of ways in terms of the way we gather our intelligence, the kind of weapons that we use to attack, timing for an attack, and also aborting or cancelling attacks when we believe it will cause more civilian casualties than we initially thought. Another measure that we take to try and implement this principle of precautions is that when circumstances allow, we provide what's called effective advance warning of attacks that could cause civilian harm. So just in this conflict, for example, we have dropped millions and millions of leaflets over Gaza calling on people to evacuate specific areas where we are going to have intensive hostilities. We've made millions of pre-recorded phone calls and SMS messages. We've made, I think, about 70,000 individual live phone calls to individual people. And we use our social media and radio broadcasts in Gaza and TV broadcasts in order to provide these messages to try and ask people to leave areas where there are going to be intensive hostilities. So we invest a lot of effort in trying to mitigate civilian harm during our military operations. It doesn't mean that it's always possible. So, for example, if my target is a person, I can't give an individual warning because then that would just allow the target to escape. So in such cases, a warning is not required. And I think one element that's interesting here for the American audience is that in our conflict, it's not taking place far away across the ocean. Our conflict is very much taking place on our borders, inside our homes, inside our sovereign territory, inside our citizens' homes and schools and clinics and wherever else Hamas invaded. So the danger that is from Gaza is much more imminent and temporarily much more proximate than in other conflicts. So that means that if I have an aerial surveillance asset and it identifies the terrorist about to launch a rocket from Gaza, if we don't take immediate action, that rocket lands up 30 seconds later in a city in Israel and can kill civilians. So sometimes that affects the kind of precautions that you can take. And that's this international law standard of feasibility. What is feasible under the circumstances, which would mean you can take steps to mitigate civilian harm, but it wouldn't frustrate entirely your need to take military action.
But there's also a concept, I think you may have mentioned it, of proportionality in response. What is that?
Yes, absolutely. Proportionality is something we hear a lot about in public discourse. So proportionality under the law of armed conflict relates to each individual attack. And what it says once you've designated something a military objective and you've considered what kind of precautions you can take to mitigate civilian harm, then you have to do a balancing exercise. You have to take, on the one hand, the anticipated military advantage that you're seeking, and on the other hand, the expected civilian harm, injury, and damage. And if the civilian harm that you expect would be caused is excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage, then you cannot carry out the attack according to this principle of proportionality. So each commander, before he carries out an attack, has to make this assessment, this judgment, in order to ensure that he's abiding by the principle of proportionality. And here too, Hamas is trying to make it difficult for us by mixing itself within the civilian population, putting itself underneath the civilian population, very much using the urban environment and its own population as human shields to try and ensure that there will always be substantial collateral harm and civilian damage and harm when we're trying to carry out our attacks.
But how about if you're using military weapons or munitions that are extremely difficult to aim or to control the scope? Bombing, for example. I've read something I read online in a publication called Lawfare. You may or may not be familiar with it. It says that the IAF has reportedly dropped over 29,000 bombs during the first 6 weeks of the war. Staggering sum for one city. I'm just reading from the article. Compares the U.S. dropping 29,000 bombs, similar number, during the entire Iraq war. Nearly half of these bombs have been unguided or so-called dumb bombs. Some of them among the largest in use, some 2,000-pound bombs and the like. I don't know whether this is accurate or not, Ben, but I mean, as described, if these are the types of military weapons that are being used, how can one gauge proportionality. And if it's a weapon that you really can't sort of control the scope, or you can't aim, you can't target, doesn't that call into question whether it should be used at all if proportionality has any meaning?
Right. Well, there are a few elements to address here. The first thing is, yes, we are taking extensive military action in Gaza. The government has set as the goal for the IDF to completely dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, to make sure that they can't commit the kinds of acts that they've committed on October 7 and since. I mean, we are still under rocket fire, where over 12,000 rockets have been fired into Israel since October 7. My kids are in bomb shelters, schools are shut around the country, and so on. So, we are taking extensive military action in Gaza. And we also have to remember that Hamas, unlike groups like ISIS, for example, they've been holding that territory in Gaza for 16 years. And they're very well resourced. They're funded by Iran. They have their weapons provided by Iran, their training provided by Iran. And they've siphoned off all this international aid, and all of it goes towards their military aims, which they state is to destroy Israel. So when you need to take such extensive military action all throughout a territory against an adversary which has spent 16 years entrenching itself, embedding itself within the urban environment, then yes, it requires a large amount of military force. And I think it's interesting to note that in previous conflicts we've had with Hamas and Gaza, we haven't used this extensive military force, because then exactly our aim was not to completely defeat Hamas. It was to ensure a measure of deterrence. Whereas because of October 7 and the realization that you can't live with this Al-Qaeda or ISIS in your backyard, we have to completely dismantle them. In terms of the weaponry that we use, so thankfully we have quite a range of weaponry and advanced weaponry, and we know how to use which munitions in which situation. There are constraints sometimes. Sometimes you might have an opportunity, a target of opportunity, and you only have a certain bomb in your arsenal, or because we're stretched on a number of fronts now, we deploy our munitions around the country in certain ways. But we, as a rule, use the kind of weaponry that is appropriate for the circumstances. So sometimes that does require bigger bombs than others. So we all know that Hamas has built hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels under the ground in Gaza. And sometimes in order to get to those tunnels, you have to use a big bomb. And when we're doing that, we do take measures to try and minimize the harm to the surroundings. So, for example, you might use a delayed fuse, so the bomb only explodes once it's already penetrated the ground. We might use the warnings and evacuation measures to try and get people out of the way, and so on. But we make sure that we only use them in circumstances, as a rule, where they're needed. And as in all circumstances, doesn't matter what kind of weaponry you're using or what the situation is, you still have to abide by these principles of distinction. Make sure you're attacking a military objective. Precautions: what can you do to mitigate civilian harm? And proportionality: is the civilian harm that I'm expecting to cause excessive to the military advantage anticipated? Now, that doesn't mean also that the outcome is always exactly what I expected it to be. So say, for example, my target is a Hamas commander, but 20 seconds before the bomb hits the building, he disappears into a tunnel under the ground. So in such a case, I haven't obtained any military advantage at all because he's escaped. But that doesn't mean I've violated the principle of proportionality, because it's something that's a conduct-orientated test. It's not a results-orientated test. No matter how many efforts we make, we can't always know exactly what is the civilian presence, or what exactly, if our intel is 100% correct. There might be technical malfunctions and so on. So a lot of these rules in the law of armed conflict are designed to ensure that people are conducting themselves in the same way, even if we know that sometimes the results might be a little bit different.
So the proportionality, as I understand it, the means used should be the collateral damage, if you will, the anticipated or anticipatable collateral damage should bear some proportionality to the military objective. Is that essentially the principle?
That's exactly right. You take on the one hand this notion of what's my expected civilian harm or civilian damage or injury. And on the other hand, you take up what's the military advantage that I'm trying to achieve in this attack. And if the civilian harm that you expect is going to be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage, then you cannot carry out the attack according to the principle of proportionality. So that's also very context dependent. So, obviously it depends what kind of high value target I have. If I'm targeting one of Hamas's top commanders who was responsible for planning and executing October 7 massacres and planning and executing the kidnapping and abduction of over 250 people, then the military advantage in taking that person out is much higher than a standard Hamas militant. Or, for example, on the stage of the operation. So in the first few weeks of the operation, we didn't have ground troops inside Gaza. We were operating from the air. So taking out Hamas anti-tank units wouldn't have given us a big military advantage. But once you have soldiers operating inside Gaza with their tanks and they're exposed, then taking out Hamas anti-tank positions or militants or capabilities suddenly gets a much higher military advantage. So it's very dependent on the circumstances, and it's very hard to identify it, for onlookers from the outside. Usually what we see in the media is we see, reports of the number of casualties and pictures of harm and damage. But it's very hard to understand from that what exactly was the anticipated military advantage and also what was the expected civilian harm that the commander took into account when he was conducting this proportionality analysis.
I have to say, as I listened to you and you talked about, how you're dealing with an enemy that is well-resourced, the history, their stated objectives, which I understand to threaten, jeopardize the very existence of your country, and your objectives of dismantling them. If you talk in terms of proportionality, it would be easy to justify almost any action under those circumstances where it's an existential threat, that the military objective is so important, so big, and so much is at stake that almost anything could be regarded as proportional and appropriate given the larger military objective of completely dismantling Hamas.
Right, that's an interesting thought. The principle of proportionality requires you to look at the very concrete military advantage that you're seeking at that moment. So if I'm about to attack a Hamas anti-tank unit, I can't say, well, that anti-tank unit is part of Hamas, which seeks to commit genocide against Israel. That military advantage is great. I know you have to look at what is the concrete and direct military advantage that I'm seeking at that moment.
Oh, so it's decided on a incident or operation by operation basis.
Absolutely, per attack. For every attack you carry out, you have to consider this element of proportionality, and that makes sense. Take for example one attack that causes 1,000 casualties. It's always a bit unpleasant to talk in this almost callous manner, but just to make the point. If you have one attack that causes 1,000 civilian casualties, you would think about that very differently than 1,000 individual attacks that cause the same number of casualties overall. So we don't look at what is the overall casualty number from a conflict. Rather, the principle of proportionality in attack requires you to assess each and individual attack on a separate basis.
Well, is it appropriate to think in terms of whether or not a particular weapon is even capable of being aimed, controlled, understanding and limiting the scope of the potential damage that it could do? There's a reference to these 2,000-pound bombs. How do you do a proportionality analysis when you're talking about weapons like that? And on the one hand, you may have in mind a particular military objective, but how do you assess, on the other hand, when it's a weapon like this where you don't know what the collateral damage would be, how do you assess the other side of the scale?
Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding here. A big bomb doesn't mean an indiscriminate bomb. For example, on the flip side, all of Hamas's rockets that it fires into Israel are indiscriminate. Some of them carry bigger warheads and some of them carry less, but they fire them into Israel purposefully in an indiscriminate manner to try and kill civilians and terrorize the civilian population. the bombs that we're using to hit military objectives in Gaza are not indiscriminate. Some are bigger than others. Some have more advanced guidance kits than others. But we still have a lot of ways of making sure that it hits the target in as many cases as we can. You can never totally wipe out technical malfunctions. You can never totally wipe out perhaps you had an error in intelligence. But it's not as if we're just carpet bombing Gaza indiscriminately. We don't even have any bombers. We only have fighter jets that carry small, relatively small payloads, and they all are fired at specific targets.
Are reports that Israel is using unguided bombs, so-called dumb bombs, are those inaccurate?
The media hype about 2,000-pound bombs, unfortunately, is replete with inaccuracies. It's not as if Israel is carpet bombing Gaza randomly with large bombs. We don't even have bomber aircraft. We use fighter jets, drones, and they're equipped with different types of munitions. And each of these munitions, we use them for a different purpose. It's true that sometimes you need a bigger bomb. The target could be bigger, a large building, or even underground, like tunnels, and we know that this is one of Hamas's main efforts. So when we do have a need to use bigger bombs, that also isn't the end of the story. We still use measures like I talked about, precautions, proportionality, all to try to mitigate harm. For example, if we're attacking tunnels, we can often delay the fuse, so the bomb only detonates once it's pierced the ground, and that reduces the fragmentation and the debris. So this term dumb bomb is also a little bit inaccurate. It just means that they're not GPS guided like precision guided bombs. But that doesn't mean they're inaccurate or indiscriminate. They are still very accurate, and there are lots of different measures from the way the bomb is built to the way the plane flies and releases the bomb that make sure they're very accurate. Now, this also doesn't mean that everything is always clean. No matter how hard we try, Hamas is keeping civilians in harm's way on purpose. There can also be technical errors, errors in intel. So we also make sure that we study and learn from incidents as the war progresses.
All right. I mean, do you feel like you have enough information as a lawyer and giving advice on the concept of proportionality? Do you feel like you have enough information to make an assessment about what the collateral damage might be, and comparing what the military tells you is the military objective, assessing the collateral damage? Do you feel like that's knowable? And does it get known to you? Do you get the information you need?
Well, that's actually not the lawyer's role. It's the intel guy's role to give information about what's the military advantage that they're seeking to achieve, and also what's the expected civilian harm. And it's the commander's role to make the proportionality assessment. Only a military commander can really know what is the value of a military advantage and whether that warrants a certain level of civilian harm or not. Now, it doesn't mean that every commander just makes up his own mind. We have rules and procedures and doctrines and policies that give guidance to these commanders, also in terms of what kind of level of command can approve certain things. But it's not the lawyer's role. The lawyer's role is to help the commanders and the team members understand what are these legal principles, how do they find expression within IDF doctrine, and to help them work through situations that might be more complex than others. But at the end of the day, the decision has to be of the military commander. Now, we put in a lot of effort to try and give the commanders as much information as they can. So as I mentioned, we have a huge intelligence gathering effort, also because we know that many of our conflicts will be in Gaza and Lebanon and on our borders with terrorist organizations that are seeking to attack us. So we're gathering intelligence throughout the year on these entities. It's not something that we come into blind. And we also have these units whose entire role is to understand about the presence of the civilian population and the movement of the civilian population, and to give the commanders in the field an understanding of what is their civilian presence. So we have, for example, in the Southern Command, a dedicated unit. It's called the Civilian Harm Mitigation Unit, and they manage this entire system of understanding where civilians are inside Gaza and helping civilians in certain areas inside Gaza evacuate where there are intensive hostilities that are going to take place, and know where they can go in order to find shelter and aid and so on. And all that information that they're constantly gathering 24/7 using open source things like social media, cell phone indication tracking, and also more covert means. So all that information is then passed on through to commanders from those who are running the operation to those who are actually doing the fighting in the field, so they can have a better understanding of what is a civilian presence.
I understand that it's ultimately the military's job to make a determination as to proportionality. I understand that that's what you've said. Is there any role for the lawyer to sort of look behind or question and satisfy himself or herself that there was a sufficient basis for the judgment that was made?
Yes, we are part of the team. So we will sit around, for example, if there's a pre-planned target process going on, so we'll sit around the table or around the computer screens and make sure that all these steps are being complied with. Now it's not always have you complied with the principle of proportionality, because all of these principles, all of these rules are interpreted into very clear military doctrine. If you think about a military, the clearest way to make sure something gets done in the army is to have rules and procedures and standards. And that's the way we do it in the IDF as well. So, before a commander can approve a certain target for attack, he has to fulfill steps that are very clearly written and required of him according to IDF doctrine. So that one of the lawyers' role is to make sure that those steps are being fulfilled when we're there in the room.
Have there ever been occasions where you've said, no, as a lawyer, I'm not satisfied, and my advice is that this operation, as described, not go forward?
Not in my experience. In over 12 years of being an international lawyer in the Army, I've never had a case where a commander has woken up one morning and said, today I'd like to kill lots of civilians, and I've had to say, no, that's would be disproportionate. I think in many respects it reflects the IDF's commitment to international law. We are the military of a democratic state. We're committed to the rule of law. The commanders understand that. I think it also reflects their values. I mean, no commander in the IDF, as a rule, sets out to cause civilian harm. I think, from our political leadership, from our senior military leadership, we've made it very clear that our fight here is with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the others who seek to attack and kill Israeli citizens. We're not out to get the Gazan population, so we have no interest.
Yeah, no, I don't mean to suggest that at all, Ben. I mean, just we have all, as lawyers, we have the experiences all the time where we advise a client not to do something. And what I'm hearing you saying is that you've never had to do that because the IDF commanders always come to you having already reached the right decision from your standpoint.
Yeah, and in some cases, we always have to remember in every area of law that the law is just the baseline. The law is just the bottom line. Don't pass that. But you can also have a lot of decisions that you implement that are over and above for different reasons. So it might be ethical. It might even be from a PR standpoint. For example, there have been a lot of cases where we've known Hamas has been using hospitals or UN facilities, and we've chosen not to take action for a variety of reasons. Now, that's not a legal analysis. In terms of the law, you would be allowed to take action. But so there are also a lot of other interests that come into play when a commander is making his decision.
I mean, are there anything from a legal standpoint that you find troubling to you? Anything that keeps you awake at night?
I mean, this whole very weird situation that you have, on one hand, a state that, is obviously and clearly and proven making substantial efforts to ensure that we're abiding by international law. We're being transparent about it. We often go beyond the requirements of the law. And on the other hand, you have this terrorist organization which has used its control over territory and population to further this unlawful and even genocidal agenda, and to really use the civilian population as shields in achieving that agenda. It's sort of this strange situation where we have to think, well, are we making sure that the law is giving a state the tools in order to achieve what it's needed? If we if we try and stop a state from achieving these very legitimate goals of making sure that Hamas can't repeat its attacks and can't continue firing rockets into Israel and continue holding hostages, including babies and women and the elderly and the sick and so on, then we almost endanger the law, because it becomes something a little bit more ineffective. So that's something that keeps me awake at night on a bigger level.
You sometimes question, given the asymmetry here and the different motivations, you sometimes find yourself asking yourself, is what I'm doing, how important is it? What role does the law play here, given this bizarre situation?
I worry more about what impact we're going to have on how the law is viewed. As I said right at the start, the fact that Hamas violates international law systematically, purposely, consistently doesn't affect our commitment to international law. And we will always be committed to operating according to international law. But, I'll just give an example. The ICRC, the Red Cross, has consistently been putting out public statements against the IDF's operations in hospitals in Gaza, talking about how hospitals need to be protected, talking about our patients and staff need to be protected, and so on. But they have not said one statement about the fact that Hamas has for years systematically and purposefully used these hospitals for its military operations, digging tunnels underneath them, taking hostages there directly, having command and control centers operating from these hospitals, and so on. And you have to think, for any sort of rational actor, when you look at that and you think, well, then what are you leaving for these states? What tools are you giving them to contend with this very real problem of a terrorist organization, which is putting patients and staff and the provision of medical services in real danger by acting in that way, but then criticizing the state that tries to stop that for its operations? And, just on a practical level, I can imagine that terrorist organizations, ISIS and Hezbollah and others around the world, are very much watching what's going on in Gaza. And if they see that only Israel is being criticized and not Hamas for its barbaric actions, then they're just going to adopt them. And then we'll have a proliferation of terrorist organizations around the world using hospitals for military purposes. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah. Did the October 7th attacks constitute war crimes? How will terrorists be treated by Israel if they're captured? Will they have be tried in a military tribunal? Will they have any trial? Tried in a regular civilian civil court, a criminal court?
So Hamas's actions on October 7, and not just on October 7, certainly constitute violations of international law. Now, war crimes are often individual violations. You can have a soldier who commits war crimes or a unit that commits war crimes. But in fact, when it's part of the terminology is systematic and widespread policy, when it's part of a systematic and widespread policy to commit these war crimes, then it's even worse. We call it crimes against humanity. And that phrase is important. These are not crimes that are just against Israeli citizens and all the other foreign citizens that were killed and tortured and maimed and beheaded and kidnapped by Hamas. But these are really crimes that go against the conscience of all humanity. And one could even argue that these constitute genocidal acts, because Hamas's stated aim is to wipe out Israel, and it took action to achieve that aim. The only reason it didn't succeed is because our security forces stopped them. If we hadn't stopped them in the weeks after October 7, they certainly would have continued on their killing spree. So they definitely constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on. And they also constitute crimes under Israeli criminal law, murder and rape and so on. So those terrorists that we have arrested inside Israel, some of them will undergo criminal trial inside Israel. There's a very big effort now to conduct those investigations and those proceedings. It's a very difficult process because of the huge, widespread nature of it, and just the amount of incidents that there were and the amount of evidence that needs to be collected. And then they'll make decisions about where exactly is the right venue for those terrorists to be tried and prosecuted.
Following the 1972 Munich Olympic massacre, Israel spent almost 20 years, I think, locating and terminating the perpetrators, an operation referred to as Wrath of God. Would there potentially be a similar operation to capture the perpetrators of October 7th?
John, I'm just a simple military lawyer. I'm not
above your pay grade.
Yeah.
Would there be a legal basis for such an operation?
I mean, the government has said very openly that its aim now is to completely dismantle Hamas's capabilities to pose a threat to Israel. And that's a very understandable aim, considering what has happened, and to return the hostages. So to do that requires us to finish the job that our soldiers are now doing in Gaza and are losing their lives every day in order to carry out. Because we're not talking about some terrorist group that, exists floating around Europe, but rather we're talking about an actual governing authority of a territory that borders Israel, then that just involves military action against Hamas in Gaza. Anything beyond those borders is out of my remit.
We have a related issue here in the World Court. South Africa has commenced a proceeding against Israel, as I understand it, alleging that Israel is engaged in war crimes itself, specifically genocide. I don't know whether this is something that you have any involvement or can make some comment on the legal background of that and the basis for such a claim.
Yes, I was in The Hague. I was part of Israel's defense team. A very, very surreal experience to be sitting in the dock almost accused of genocide, when what clearly the IDF is engaged in, this is what we proved to the court, is that we're engaged in an armed conflict against a considerable adversary who is show no qualms about doing the most barbaric acts known to man, and doesn't hide that it intends to continue doing that until it destroys Israel. So our aim was to show to the court that what Israel is doing is very much the opposite of genocide. So we presented there things like our civilian harm mitigation efforts that I talked to you about before, how we try to evacuate certain areas, how we choose our munitions, give warnings before strikes, abort strikes when there are unexpected civilian presence, and so on. And we also talked a lot about our efforts to alleviate suffering in Gaza, because no matter how much effort you make to mitigate civilian harm, obviously the very essence of urban warfare is to result in civilian harm and damage. And that's only exacerbated when you have one party to the conflict who uses its own population as human shields. So we also making a very big effort to alleviate humanitarian suffering by facilitating humanitarian aid, by helping countries set up field hospitals, even floating hospitals, by coordinating the repair of infrastructure that's damaged during the fighting, by monitoring the situation in Gaza and helping countries who donate aid to prioritize certain types of aid, by facilitating the evacuation of medical patients from Gaza to overseas, and then so on and so forth. So we talked a lot about those efforts, and I think they show very clearly, that you just cannot import any plausible inference of genocide to Israel.
As I understand, South Africa, and I don't really understand the basis for standing, but as I understand, South Africa has sought some type of preliminary relief from the World Court. First, is that correct? And second, when do you expect a ruling on that?
Yes, they're seeking what's called provisional measures, because a court case can take a long time. So there's this method which allows for obtaining provisional measures, so that while the case is continuing, the court can make demands of the parties if they think that perhaps genocide might be relevant here. The challenge here is that bar for granting provisional measures is very, very low. And that's what South Africa is seeking to take advantage of. They sought to throw us before the court using this very wide jurisdiction that's given to states because of the serious nature of genocide and this very low bar of achieving provisional measures. So even if in a case down the line, every one of their allegations is completely thrown out for being unfounded, they still could walk away shortly with these provisional measures, which could impact Israel's ability to continue the operations in Gaza. We expect the ruling on provisional measures to be quite quick. In previous cases, it's been in a matter of weeks since the hearing has been held. So we should be receiving it shortly.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I mean, the issues you deal with are obviously extremely challenging and difficult. I mean, it's mind-boggling, I think, for a lot of people to even think about the concept of a law of war and making the kind of legal calls that you're called on to make in the chaos and tragedy that's unfolding in Gaza. We very much appreciate your sharing your experiences and perspectives and judgments with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's been an absolute pleasure. And, we sit here and we feel the support of the American people and the American administration. And it means a lot to us, both on a practical level, but also, just to know that support is there. So thank you. And hopefully we'll speak again soon on better issues.
Look forward to that. So we've been speaking with Major Ben Wahlhaus, who's a lawyer in the International Law Department of the Israeli Defense Force and has the job of advising the Israeli Defense Force on law of war issues on an ongoing current basis concerning the tragedy unfolding in Gaza. This is John Quinn. This has been Law Disrupted. Thank you for listening to Law Disrupted with me, John Quinn. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on your chosen podcast app. To stay up to date with the latest episodes, you can sign up for email alerts at our website, law-disrupted.fm, or follow me on X at JBQ Law or at Quinn Emanuel. Thank you for tuning in.